Close your eyes and imagine this. Right now, in the 21st century, we have detailed records of nearly everything. What you ate for breakfast, your search history, satellite images of your house from space. We track everything. Go back 500 years, and we've got written records, paintings, artifacts. Go back 2,000 years to the early indigenous empires of the Americas, and we've still got incredible documentation. Earthworks, pottery, entire oral traditions. Push back to 5,000 years ago, and we're looking at the first settlements, the earliest trade networks, the dawn of what we call civilization. But here's where it gets weird. Really weird. Anatomically modern humans, people who looked exactly like us, with brains just as capable as ours, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Maybe longer. That's 300,000 years of human beings walking around with the same biological hardware you're using right now to understand these words. The same capacity for language, problem-solving, creativity, planning. Yet our entire recorded history, everything we call civilization, only goes back about 5,000 years. Do the math. That means 99% of modern human existence is just missing, gone. A vast empty space in our past that we know almost nothing about. 295,000 years of anatomically modern humans doing what? Exactly. That's not a gap. That's a canyon. An abyss. A prehistoric time gap so enormous it should keep you up at night. Except you're here to fall asleep, which is perfect, because that's exactly why I make these videos. If you're using this to drift off, go ahead and subscribe. And here's something I love. Comment and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I read through them, and it's genuinely mind-blowing. New York at sunrise, Seattle at midnight, Austin during lunch break, all watching the same video at the same moment across completely different realities. There's something beautiful about that. But back to this mystery that refuses to make sense. See, the standard story you learned in school goes something like this. Early humans were primitive hunter-gatherers, basically clever apes, wandering around in small groups for hundreds of thousands of years. They made simple stone tools, lived in caves, struggled to survive. Then, suddenly, around 10,000 years ago, boom. Agriculture, civilization, writing, cities, the great mounds. The whole package just appeared, and we've been advancing ever since. It's a nice, clean narrative. It's also looking more and more like it might be completely wrong, because the deeper scientists dig, literally and figuratively, the more evidence they find that doesn't fit. Ancient structures that shouldn't exist yet. Astronomical knowledge encoded in prehistoric sites that seems impossibly sophisticated. Genetic bottlenecks that suggest humanity went through catastrophic events we have no memory of. Population patterns that make no mathematical sense. Technologies and techniques that appeared fully formed with no clear development process. It's like finding a smartphone in a colonial painting. Except we keep finding more and more smartphones, and nobody can explain how they got there. The archaeological record is screaming at us that something's missing. Some crucial chapter of human history got erased, lost, buried under ice or ocean or time itself. And the really unsettling part? Multiple ancient cultures from across the continent, civilizations that supposedly never contacted each other, all tell eerily similar stories. Stories of great floods, advanced ancestors, lost golden ages. Knowledge passed down from before. Before what? Before the world changed. Before the disaster. Before the forgetting. Most scientists dismissed these stories as mythology, imagination, primitive attempts to explain a confusing world. But what if they weren't? What if scattered throughout these ancient tales are fragments of actual memory, evidence of a human story far more complex and mysterious than we ever imagined? Tonight, we're going deep into this gap, this impossible, fascinating, frustrating hole in our history. We're going to explore the mind-bending theories trying to explain it, the hard evidence that mainstream archaeology struggles to account for, the ancient sites that seem to defy everything we think we know about prehistoric humans, the technologies that appeared thousands of years too early, the genetic mysteries written in our DNA, the underwater ruins that suggest coastlines looked very different when they were built, the astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. And here's what makes this perfect for falling asleep. These aren't questions with simple answers. They're deep, slow mysteries, the kind that let your mind wander and drift, the kind that don't demand you stay alert. Just let the information wash over you. Let the mystery settle into your thoughts as you drift off. Because whether you're here to learn or just to find some peace before sleep, this story works either way. We're about to journey back through that vast, dark, unexplained gap in human history. And I promise you, by the end, you'll never think about our past quite the same way again. So get comfortable. Let's dive into the prehistoric time gap that science still can't explain. Now here's where the story gets really strange. Because everything I've just told you about the bottleneck, about the near extinction, about the splitting into 3 species, that all happened hundreds of thousands of years before modern civilization appeared. And that creates one of the most baffling mysteries in all of human history. Your brain, the one you're using right now to follow this story, is anatomically identical to the brains of humans who lived 300,000 years ago. Same size, same structure, same potential for complex thought, creativity, problem-solving. If you could somehow transport a baby from 300,000 years ago to the present, raise them in a modern home in the suburbs, send them to public schools, they would be completely indistinguishable from any other child. They could learn calculus, speak multiple languages, become doctors or engineers or artists. Their brain would be just as capable as yours. So here's the question that should be keeping scientists awake at night. If humans have had modern brains for 300,000 years, why did civilization only appear 10,000 years ago? What were we doing for the other 290,000 years? This is what anthropologists call the anatomically modern human paradox. And it's not just about brain size. The archaeological evidence shows that early humans were demonstrably intelligent. They weren't primitive ape men stumbling around in the dark. They were us, with all our cognitive potential, just living in a very different world. Consider the tools. By 200,000 years ago, humans in the Americas were creating sophisticated stone tools that required extensive planning and skill to manufacture. They were using heat treatment to alter the properties of stone, making it easier to work. This is materials science. They had to understand that heating certain rocks to specific temperatures would change their molecular structure in useful ways. That's not instinct. That's experimentation, knowledge accumulation, and teaching. By 100,000 years ago, they were making composite tools, hafting stone points to wooden shafts using adhesives made from tree resins. They had to find the right trees, extract the resin, possibly heat it to the correct consistency, and apply it at just the right moment in the construction process. This requires forward planning, multi-step reasoning, and the ability to hold complex procedural knowledge in mind while executing each step. And then there's the art. In caverns deep within the Grand Canyon, archaeologists found pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns dating to 73,000 years ago. These aren't random scratches. They're deliberate, repeated patterns that show planning and aesthetic intention. Someone sat down with a piece of ochre and carefully carved abstract designs into it. Why? What was the purpose? We don't know, but the fact that they did it at all tells us they were capable of symbolic thinking, of creating meaning beyond immediate survival needs. Shell beads, carefully drilled and strung together, appear in the archaeological record starting around 100,000 years ago. Personal adornment, fashion, social signaling. These people weren't just trying to survive. They were thinking about status, identity, group membership. They were creating culture. By 40,000 years ago, humans were creating elaborate cave paintings in the southwest, intricate carvings in the Pacific Northwest, sophisticated burial practices that show they had developed complex belief systems about death and the afterlife. They were making musical instruments, telling stories, almost certainly speaking fully modern languages. So what's the problem? The problem is that for hundreds of thousands of years, despite having all this cognitive capacity, despite being demonstrably intelligent and creative, human populations remained small. Technology advanced, but slowly, incrementally. There were no cities, no agriculture, no writing, no mathematics, none of the things we associate with civilization. From 300,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, humans lived in small groups, moving seasonally, hunting and gathering, creating tools and art, but never building anything that lasted, never accumulating knowledge into the kind of explosive technological growth we've seen in the last few thousand years. Why? What was holding us back? Some scientists think the answer lies in population size. Small groups living in isolation can innovate, but their innovations often die with them. There's no critical mass of people to maintain and build on new ideas. Every generation has to relearn what the previous generation knew. Progress happens, but it's fragile, easily lost when groups die out or migrate to new territories. But others think something more dramatic was at play. Something that not only kept populations small, but actually reset human progress multiple times, forcing survivors to rebuild from almost nothing. Enter the Yellowstone catastrophe. 74,000 years ago, the Yellowstone supervolcano in what is now Wyoming erupted with the force of 1,000 nuclear weapons. It wasn't just a volcanic eruption. It was a supervolcano, one of the largest explosive events in the last 2 million years. The eruption ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it likely triggered a volcanic winter lasting 6 to 10 years. Temperatures dropped. Sunlight was blocked. Plant life died off across vast regions. The animals that depended on those plants starved, and the humans who depended on those animals faced extinction. The genetic evidence suggests something catastrophic happened around this time. When geneticists analyze human DNA, looking at the variation between different populations, they find something shocking. Humans have remarkably low genetic diversity compared to other species. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have 3 to 4 times more genetic variation than we do, despite having much smaller populations. This lack of diversity suggests a recent bottleneck, a moment when human population crashed to a tiny fraction of its previous size. The Yellowstone eruption is the perfect candidate for this event. Some estimates suggest that human population might have dropped to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals worldwide. That's it. Fewer people than currently live in a small town like Sedona, scattered across an entire planet that had just become almost uninhabitable. These weren't different groups living in different places. These were the only humans left. Everyone alive today is descended from that tiny population of survivors. Think about what that means for a moment. Every human innovation, every tool design, every piece of knowledge about where to find food or how to make fire, all of it was carried in the minds of maybe 10,000 people struggling to survive in a world covered in ash. How much knowledge was lost? How many innovations simply disappeared because the people who knew them died before they could pass them on? Maybe humans had been on the verge of something greater before Yellowstone. Maybe populations were growing, trade networks were expanding, technologies were becoming more sophisticated. And then the volcano erupted and wiped almost all of it away, leaving only scattered survivors who had to focus on basic survival rather than innovation. The bottleneck might explain why human progress seems frozen for so long. We weren't frozen. We were repeatedly set back to almost zero, forced to rebuild again and again from the knowledge carried by a handful of survivors. But here's what makes this even more interesting. The bottleneck didn't make us weaker. It made us stronger. The humans who survived Yellowstone weren't random individuals. They were the ones smart enough, adaptable enough, cooperative enough to make it through the worst environmental disaster in human history. Natural selection compressed into a few desperate generations, favoring every trait that enhanced survival. When populations finally began to recover after Yellowstone, these survivors carried genes that had been ruthlessly selected for intelligence, social cooperation, and adaptability. Their descendants spread out from whatever refuges had sheltered them, carrying enhanced cognitive abilities and stronger social instincts than their pre-Yellowstone ancestors. Maybe this is why behavioral modernity appears so suddenly in the archaeological record around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Not because humans suddenly evolved new capabilities, but because the post-Yellowstone population finally reached critical mass. Enough people, spread across enough territory, maintaining enough connections to create self-sustaining innovation networks. For the first time in human history, new ideas could spread faster than they could be lost. Technologies could build on previous technologies. Cultural knowledge could accumulate rather than being repeatedly wiped out. But even with all this, even with enhanced intelligence and growing populations, humans still didn't create what we would recognize as civilization. No cities. No empires, no written records. For another 40,000 years, humans remained hunter-gatherers, living in small groups, moving with the seasons, creating art and tools and culture, but never settling down, never building permanent structures that would last millennia. The paradox deepens, because clearly these people had the cognitive capacity for civilization. Their brains were identical to ours. The Yellowstone survivors and their descendants were smart enough to create everything we've created. So why didn't they? Was it just that the conditions weren't right? that you need agriculture before you can have cities, and agriculture only became possible or necessary when climate conditions changed after the last ice age? Or is there something else? Something we're missing in the archaeological record? Some development that happened but left no trace, or left traces in places we haven't looked yet? Because here's the uncomfortable truth that the anatomically modern human paradox forces us to confront. For 290,000 years, humans who were just as smart as us, just as creative, just as capable, lived and died without creating anything like modern civilization. And we don't really know why. We have theories, educated guesses, reasonable explanations. But we don't know. And if we don't know why they didn't build civilizations, how can we be sure they didn't? How can we be certain that in 290,000 years, in all that vast expanse of time, nothing was built that has since been lost? That no knowledge was accumulated that has since been forgotten? That our ancestors never achieved anything we would find remarkable, only to have it swept away by the next climate disaster, the next volcanic winter, the next great dying? The anatomically modern human paradox isn't just about explaining why civilization appeared so late. It's about confronting the uncomfortable possibility that we might not know the full story of what humans achieved, what they built, what they knew, in all those long millennia before recorded history began. And as we're about to see, there's evidence that suggests our ancestors might have been more accomplished than we ever imagined. But what if everything we think we know about prehistoric human civilization is wrong? Not slightly off. Not just missing a few details. What if entire chapters of human history are literally underwater, erased from the archaeological record by forces so massive they reshaped continents? Because here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. During the last ice age, which ended just 11,700 years ago, sea levels were 400 feet lower than they are today. That's the height of a 40-story building. 400 feet of vertical space that's now ocean was once dry land. Habitable land. Prime real estate for human settlement. Think about where humans naturally settle. Not mountain tops. Not deep inland plateaus. Throughout all of recorded history, humans have consistently chosen coastal areas, river valleys, places where land meets water. It's not hard to understand why. Water means fish, shellfish, transportation routes, trade opportunities. The most productive ecosystems on Earth are coastal zones, where terrestrial and marine resources overlap. Today, more than 40% of the world's population lives within 60 miles of a coastline. There's no reason to think prehistoric humans were any different. Now here's the problem. If sea levels rose 400 feet at the end of the Ice Age, then any coastal civilizations from that period are now underwater. Not just their port facilities or beach houses. Their entire territories. Everything within dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles of what they would have known as coastline is now beneath the waves. We're not talking about small patches of land. We're talking about land masses the size of states. Entire regions that existed during the Ice Age and were swallowed by rising seas when the glaciers melted. Take the Beringia Land Bridge. For most of human history, Alaska wasn't just a peninsula. It was connected to Asia by a vast landmass that stretched across the Bering Strait. This wasn't some narrow path. Beringia covered an area roughly the size of Texas. It had hills and valleys, forests and wetlands, rivers that don't exist anymore, and lakes that vanished when the seas rose. We know about Beringia because fishing trawlers keep dragging up evidence. Mammoth bones, ancient tools, worked flints, fossils of animals that haven't lived in that region for 10,000 years. In 1931, a fishing boat pulled up a beautiful barbed antler point, clearly manufactured by human hands, from 25 miles off the coast of Virginia. The Sinmar discovery, as it's sometimes called, was dated to around 10,000 BCE. But here's the thing. That fishing net could have been dropping anywhere in thousands of square miles of ocean floor, which means that single artifact represents just one tiny point in what must have been a vast, populated landscape. How many other sites are down there? How many settlements, workshop areas, ceremonial centers? We'll never know, because investigating underwater sites is exponentially more difficult and expensive than traditional archaeology. Most of these submerged coastlines will remain unexplored, their secrets preserved in darkness beneath the Atlantic and Pacific. But at least we know Beringia existed. We can map its topography using seafloor sonar, model what the landscape looked like, estimate where people might have lived. What's more disturbing is thinking about all the other drowned landscapes we haven't even identified yet. All the land masses that disappeared when the Ice Age ended and haven't left convenient artifact fields for fishing boats to sample. Consider this. When sea levels were 400 feet lower, the entire continental shelf was exposed. The continental shelf is that relatively shallow underwater plain that extends outward from the coast before dropping off into the deep ocean. During the Ice Age, this wasn't shelf. It was land. Thousands upon thousands of square miles of prime real estate, all of it now submerged. In the Gulf of Mexico, the shelf exposure extended the Florida Peninsula by hundreds of miles. The islands of the Caribbean were massive land masses, some connected to the mainland. In California, the Channel Islands were one giant superisland. All of this land was available for human habitation, and based on what we know about human settlement patterns, it was probably densely populated, at least by prehistoric standards. So where's the evidence? Where are the ruins? Mostly, they're gone. When you flood a landscape, especially one that's been underwater for 11,000 years, the archaeological record doesn't just get hidden. It gets destroyed. Sediment accumulates. Currents erode structures. Marine organisms colonize surfaces, breaking them down. Wooden structures rot away completely. Even stone buildings crumble under the relentless action of water and time. But not everything disappears. And that's where the story gets really interesting. Because scattered around the waters of North America, in places that were once dry land, there are structures that shouldn't be there. Formations that look too regular, too purposeful to be natural. And they're located in places that align perfectly with where human settlements would have been during the Ice Age. The most famous are the Catalina stones, off the coast of California. In 1987, a dive instructor named Ken Arnold was exploring waters near Catalina Island, looking for good spots to photograph kelp forests. Instead, he found something that would launch decades of controversy. Massive stone formations that look unervingly like terraced platforms. Flat surfaces connected by right-angle steps. Long straight edges. Carved channels. Formations that seem to show tool marks and deliberate shaping. The site covers about 50,000 square feet and rises from the depths up to the shallow shelf. Geologist Mark King from UCLA spent years studying the formation. His conclusion? It's a man-made structure, constructed when sea levels were lower, then submerged when the Ice Age ended. Based on geological dating of when that area was last above water, that would make the Catalina stones at least 10,000 years old, possibly older. Mainstream archaeology doesn't buy it. The general consensus is that the site is a natural formation, created by tectonic activity and erosion along the fault lines. The parallel lines, geological fractures, the right angles, chance alignments of natural rock layers, the apparent tool marks, wishful thinking and pattern recognition. But here's where it gets complicated. Nobody disputes that the formations exist. The question is whether they're natural or artificial, and that question is harder to answer than you might think. Because when you're dealing with structures that have been underwater for 10,000 years, the line between natural and artificial becomes blurry. Did humans find natural formations and modify them? Did they build entirely new structures? Or are we looking at nothing but geology and seeing what we want to see? The debate continues because nobody can definitively prove it either way. To confirm human construction, you'd need clear evidence of tool marks, quarrying techniques, or construction methods that couldn't occur naturally. But 10,000 years of submersion has eroded or obscured exactly the kind of fine detail that would prove human involvement. It's the perfect, unsolvable mystery, suggestive enough to inspire endless speculation, ambiguous enough that conclusive proof remains just out of reach. And Catalina isn't alone. Off the coast of Florida, on the escarpment, sonar surveys in 2001 identified what appeared to be regular geometric patterns on the seafloor. Long, straight formations, right-angle intersections, rectangular depressions. The Discovery team, from a private exploration institute, dredged up artifacts from the site. Pottery fragments, beads, pieces of worked wood. They announced that radiocarbon dating placed some of the wood fragments at 9,500 years old. If confirmed, this would represent evidence of a substantial settlement that predates the earliest known settlements in the region by thousands of years. The Florida discovery suggests that sophisticated urban centers existed in the Americas thousands of years before we thought complex civilization emerged here. But again, controversy erupted. Other researchers questioned the dating methodology. They pointed out that wooden fragments can drift with currents, meaning old wood doesn't necessarily prove old structures. The sonar images, while suggestive, weren't clear enough to definitively show artificial construction. Restrictions on the site for environmental protection prevented further research. Without independent verification, the Florida site remains tantalizing but unproven. Similar claims emerge regularly from underwater sites around the continent. Stone formations off the coast of Cuba that some researchers interpret as roads and buildings. Regularly spaced stones off the Bimini coast. Apparently artificial structures in the Great Lakes. Each discovery sparks the same cycle. Initial excitement, mainstream skepticism, endless debate, no resolution. Here's what we can say with certainty. The underwater landscape is vastly underexplored. We've mapped more of the moon's surface than we have of our own coastal shelves. The technical challenges of underwater archaeology are immense. Visibility is often measured in feet, not miles. Working time is limited by dive constraints. Equipment is expensive. Funding is scarce. Most institutions focus their resources on traditional terrestrial sites where the archaeology is clearer and the logistics are simpler. This creates a massive sampling bias in our understanding of prehistory. We've thoroughly explored inland sites, places that were never threatened by rising seas. But we've barely scratched the surface of coastal areas, where the majority of humans probably lived. It's like trying to understand modern American civilization by only excavating in the Mojave Desert and never investigating New York, Boston, or San Francisco. The mathematical improbability of having found all major prehistoric sites becomes obvious when you think about the numbers. Archaeological surveys have covered maybe 10% of terrestrial areas where prehistoric humans are known to have lived. That's 10% of the land that's still above water. For the continental shelves, the drowned coastlines where Ice Age humans almost certainly concentrated, we've explored far less than 1%. Probably less than 0.1%. What are the odds that the 1% of sites we've actually investigated represent the full scope of prehistoric human achievement? Essentially zero. It would be like future archaeologists studying 21st century America, but only having access to rural Wyoming. They might find ranch houses and small towns. What they wouldn't find are skyscrapers, universities, tech hubs, or anything that reveals the true complexity and sophistication of our society. The same logic applies to prehistory. The sites we've found, impressive as they are, might represent the countryside of ancient civilizations. Their true centers, their great cities and ceremonial complexes, might be hundreds of feet underwater, buried under sediment, invisible to archaeology. Now, we have to be careful not to jump from "we haven't found everything" to "therefore, advanced civilizations existed." Those are two very different claims. Just because something is possible doesn't make it true. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of presence, but it is evidence of ignorance. And that's the point. We don't know what's down there. We don't know what the full scope of prehistoric human achievement was. We've explored enough to know that humans were doing surprising things much earlier than we thought. Granite Peak, which we'll discuss in detail later, proved that humans were building massive stone complexes 11,600 years ago, millennia before agriculture was supposed to have made such projects possible. If something that sophisticated existed inland, what existed on the coasts? What engineering feats, what astronomical observations, what accumulated knowledge might have been achieved by coastal populations who had the advantage of trade routes, abundant resources, and the economic surplus that coastal living provides? The end of the Ice Age wasn't a gradual, gentle process. It was catastrophic. Sea levels didn't rise steadily over thousands of years. They rose in pulses, sometimes jumping 10 or 20 feet in a single century as massive ice dams broke and glacial lakes drained into the ocean. Around 8,200 years ago, the final drainage of Glacial Lake Agassiz in North America released so much fresh water into the North Atlantic that it temporarily disrupted ocean currents and caused a global cooling event. Imagine living through that. You're a member of a coastal community, perhaps a society that's been developing for thousands of years. Your ancestors have lived in the same region for hundreds of generations. You have fields, settlements, ceremonial centers. Then, over the course of a few generations, the sea begins to rise. Not dramatically at first. A few inches a year. Easy to ignore. But it doesn't stop. Year after year, decade after decade, the ocean advances. Fields become salt marshes. Villages have to be abandoned. Sacred sites disappear beneath the waves. Eventually, you're forced to retreat inland, away from the resources and trade routes that made your civilization prosperous. Your population fragments. Knowledge is lost. The sophisticated society your great-grandparents knew collapses into scattered survivors trying to adapt to unfamiliar inland territories. This scenario played out all over the world as sea levels rose by 400 feet over roughly 10,000 years. It was slow enough that humans could migrate ahead of the rising waters. But it was fast enough that entire ways of life were lost. Entire landscapes, containing who knows how many generations of human achievement, were drowned and forgotten. The survivors would have kept stories, flood myths, tales of lost homelands, memories of ancestors who lived in places that no longer existed. And if you look at mythology from indigenous cultures across the Americas, that's exactly what you find. Stories of great floods, narratives of worlds destroyed by rising waters. Common themes that appear in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Are these myths just coincidence? Or are they cultural memories of real events, transmitted through countless generations, distorted by time but preserving a kernel of truth about the catastrophe that ended the Ice Age? We don't know. And that's the most honest answer archaeology can provide. The evidence exists, fragmentary and ambiguous, scattered across ocean floors we've barely explored. The hypothesis is plausible. The timeline matches. The mechanism makes sense. But proof remains elusive, hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water, buried under thousands of years of sediment, waiting for a level of underwater archaeological investigation we haven't yet achieved. The civilizations that might have existed during the Ice Age aren't lost because they weren't real. They're lost because they were in the worst possible location, right on the coastline, right where rising seas would destroy them most thoroughly. And until we develop the technology and commit the resources to properly explore the drowned world, they'll remain where they are, in the dark, in the cold, beneath the waves, silent witnesses to chapters of human history we can barely imagine and may never recover. Now, we need to talk about the discovery that broke archaeology. Not bent it, not challenged it, broke it completely. Shattered centuries of carefully constructed theories about how civilization began and forced scientists to acknowledge something that makes most of them deeply uncomfortable. There's a massive gap in our understanding of prehistoric human capability, and sitting right in the middle of that gap is a mountain in New Mexico that nobody paid attention to for thousands of years. Until 1994. That's when an American archaeologist named Clay Smith looked at a hill called Granite Peak and decided to actually dig into it. Local ranchers had been finding carved stones there for generations, but everyone assumed it was just an old pioneer landmark. Nothing special. Smith thought differently. He had this nagging suspicion that the hill wasn't natural, that it was hiding something. So he started excavating. What he found in the first few days of digging should not exist. Massive stone pillars. Not small rocks, not crude markers. Pillars weighing up to 16 tons each, carved from solid bedrock, transported somehow to this hilltop, and erected in perfect circles. Each pillar was decorated with elaborate carvings, animals, abstract symbols, human-like figures with their hands positioned as if they were participating in some kind of ritual. The artwork wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated, detailed, showing artistic skill that would have taken generations to develop. But here's the thing that made Smith stop breathing for a moment. When he dated the site, when he used every available method to figure out how old these structures were, he got an answer that didn't make sense. 11,600 years old. Not 6,000. Not 8,000. 11,600 years ago. This meant Granite Peak was built roughly 6,000 years before any known major monumental architecture in the region. 7,000 years before the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. At a time when every history textbook says humans were supposed to be primitive hunter-gatherers, barely surviving, living in small nomadic bands, with no capacity for large-scale organization or monumental construction. According to everything we thought we knew about human development, the people who built Granite Peak shouldn't have existed. Not with that level of skill. Not with that degree of social organization. Not with the astronomical knowledge they clearly possessed. Because these weren't just pretty circles of stones. The pillars were aligned. Precisely aligned to track celestial events. Solstices, equinoxes, possibly even the precession of specific star systems. The carvings themselves seem to encode astronomical information. Some researchers think they represent a map of the ancient night sky, showing constellations as they appeared 13,000 years ago. One carved pillar, called the Eagle Stone, appears to depict a comet impact event, possibly the Younger Dryas comet that triggered global climate catastrophe around 10,800 BCE. Think about what this means. The conventional narrative of human civilization goes like this. First, humans learned agriculture. Then, because farming created food surpluses, people could settle in one place. Then, because settled communities had more resources, they could support specialized workers. Then, and only then, could they build monuments. Agriculture leads to settlement, leads to specialization, leads to architecture. That's the pyramid of civilization. Every anthropology textbook teaches it. Granite Peak destroys this model completely. The people who built this site weren't farmers. There's no evidence of agriculture at Granite Peak. None. No domesticated plant remains, no agricultural tools, no storage facilities for grain. The animal bones found at the site come from wild species. Deer, bison, wild turkey. These were hunter-gatherers. People who shouldn't have had the ability to organize hundreds, maybe thousands of workers to quarry, transport, and erect massive stone pillars. But they did it anyway. The construction itself is mind-boggling. Each of those 16-ton pillars had to be quarried from bedrock using stone tools. Not metal. Stone. Then they had to be transported, somehow, to the hilltop. Some of these pillars came from quarries over a quarter-mile away. You try moving a 16-ton block of stone a quarter-mile using only Stone Age technology and see how it goes. Then they had to be lifted upright and positioned precisely. The pillars stand in circles, perfectly spaced, with the tops carved into T-shapes that suggest they might have supported roofing or additional structures. The whole complex isn't just one circle either. Initial excavations revealed multiple circular structures, each with its own arrangement of pillars. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there are at least 20 circles in total, most still buried. The visible structures represent maybe 5% of the site. And here's where it gets even stranger. After Granite Peak was used for perhaps 1,000 years, someone deliberately buried it. Not abandoned it. Not let it decay naturally. Buried it. Carefully, systematically, filling in the circles with tons of rubble and soil. Someone went to enormous effort to hide this place, to preserve it underground. Why? What were they protecting? Or what were they trying to forget? Clay Smith spent the rest of his life trying to answer these questions. He died in 2014, and the excavations continue today, but every new discovery raises more questions than it answers. Because Granite Peak isn't unique. It's just the largest, the oldest, and the most intact example of something that's showing up all over the continent. In the American Southwest alone, similar anomalous sites have been identified. Choco Canyon, while younger, shows similar astronomical precision. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. Each one features construction with astronomical alignments and sophisticated design. But it's not just the U.S. Similar megalithic structures from roughly the same mysterious period keep appearing globally. The Hypogeum in Malta, the Bimini Road, the underwater ruins of Yonaguni. Even the ancient mounds of Poverty Point in Louisiana show surprisingly sophisticated engineering from indigenous peoples long before conventional timelines suggested such capability existed. All of these sites share certain characteristics. Construction using stones or earthworks far larger than necessary. Astronomical alignments that demonstrate detailed celestial knowledge. Symbolic artwork that suggests complex religious or philosophical systems. And many seem to point back to that critical window between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago. This is the period immediately after the Younger Dryas, the most recent and one of the most severe climate catastrophes in human history. For over 1,000 years, from about 10,800 to 9,600 BCE, global temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly advanced again. Sea levels dropped and then rose rapidly. Ecosystems collapsed. Many large animal species went extinct. It was a global disaster. And then, immediately after it ended, these sophisticated structures start appearing. Almost like some group of people who had survived the catastrophe, suddenly decided to build permanent monuments, to encode knowledge in stone, to create structures that would last, that would survive whatever catastrophes might come next. This is where conventional archaeology starts getting really uncomfortable, because the implication is obvious. If hunter-gatherers built Granite Peak, if they possessed the astronomical knowledge, the organizational capability, and the construction skills to create these monuments, where did they learn these things? You don't just wake up one morning and decide to build a 16-ton astronomical observatory. These skills take generations to develop. The astronomical knowledge encoded in these sites requires centuries of careful observation and record-keeping. The construction techniques require accumulated engineering experience passed down through apprenticeships and teaching systems. This suggests there was a sophisticated culture before Granite Peak, a culture that developed these capabilities over long periods, a culture that was then disrupted, possibly destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and the survivors, the people who remembered the old knowledge, built these monuments as a way to preserve what they knew for future generations. Some researchers call this the lost culture hypothesis. The idea that there was an advanced culture, not necessarily with our level of technology, but with sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, engineering, and mathematics, that existed before the known dawn of civilization. A culture that was wiped out or severely disrupted by climate catastrophe, leaving only scattered survivors who tried to rebuild and preserve what they could. This makes most mainstream archaeologists extremely uncomfortable, because it requires admitting that civilization might be much older than we think, that there might have been rises and falls we don't know about, that the neat linear progression we teach, from primitive to complex, might be completely wrong. But the stones don't lie. Granite Peak exists. It was built 11,600 years ago by people who aren't supposed to have that capability. And it's not alone. The fundamental question isn't whether these sites exist. They do. The question is what triggered their creation. What knowledge or event caused supposedly primitive humans to suddenly, simultaneously across multiple regions, start building permanent monuments with astronomical alignments and encoded knowledge? Was it simply the end of the Ice Age, allowing human populations to expand and develop in ways they couldn't during the harsh glacial period? That's the conservative explanation. Or was it something else? Were these sites built by survivors of an earlier sophisticated culture, trying to preserve knowledge through a dark age? We don't know. That's the honest answer. We have the archaeological evidence, the stones, the carvings, the astronomical alignments. But we don't have the full story. We have chapters missing from the book of human history, and Granite Peak is just the first page we've managed to uncover. And here's what keeps archaeologists up at night. If we're wrong about when civilization began, if it's thousands of years older than we thought, what else are we wrong about? How much knowledge did ancient people possess that we've dismissed because it doesn't fit our timeline? The answers might be buried under hills we've walked past for centuries, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find them. But what if there's another layer to this story? What if something happened that we've been missing all along? A catastrophe so devastating that it nearly wiped the slate clean, erasing evidence of everything that came before it? This is where things get controversial, where mainstream archaeology and alternative researchers clash in bitter disagreement, where the evidence gets murky and the interpretations diverge wildly. But it's also where some of the most compelling mysteries emerge. Grant Hayes calls it the ancient apocalypse theory, the idea that somewhere around 12,800 years ago, an advanced Ice Age civilization was destroyed by a cosmic catastrophe so devastating that it nearly reset human history. And before you dismiss this as fringe pseudoscience, consider that parts of this theory are based on very real, very troubling evidence that mainstream science is still struggling to explain. Let's start with what we know for certain. 12,800 years ago, Earth's climate was in a relatively warm period between ice ages. The great glaciers that had covered much of North America were slowly retreating. Human populations were expanding. Archaeological sites from this period show increasingly sophisticated tool-making, art, and social organization. Things were, by all appearances, looking up for humanity. Then something catastrophic happened. The geological record shows it clearly. A sudden, dramatic return to near Ice Age conditions. Temperatures plummeting by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions within just a few decades. This cold snap lasted for nearly 1,300 years, a period geologists call the Younger Dryas. And what makes it particularly mysterious is that it happened suddenly, violently, in a way that doesn't fit normal climate patterns. Climate changes in Earth's history usually happen gradually. But the Younger Dryas was different. It hit like a hammer. One generation living in relatively comfortable conditions, the next facing climate catastrophe. For decades, scientists struggled to explain this. The leading theory was that melting glaciers had disrupted ocean currents, causing the sudden temperature drop. That made sense, fit the data reasonably well, and became the accepted explanation. Then in 2007, a group of researchers led by physicist Richard Stone proposed something radical. They suggested that the Younger Dryas wasn't caused by ocean currents at all. It was caused by a cosmic impact. Multiple impacts, actually. A fragmenting comet or asteroid that struck Earth in several locations, triggering wildfires, disrupting climate patterns, and causing devastation on a scale that humanity wouldn't see again until the modern era. The evidence they presented was startling. At dozens of sites across North America, researchers found a distinctive layer of sediment dating to exactly 12,800 years ago. This layer, called the black mat by geologists, contains materials that shouldn't be there. Nanodiamonds, microscopic particles that only form under extreme temperatures and pressures. Magnetic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock that suggest massive fires. High concentrations of platinum and iridium, elements rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. And perhaps most tellingly, a form of carbon called fullerenes with extraterrestrial gases trapped inside them. This isn't the kind of evidence you can easily dismiss. These materials exist. They're found at the right depth, dating to the right time period, distributed across the continent. Something happened 12,800 years ago that scattered cosmic debris across much of North America. But here's where it gets really interesting and really controversial. If there was a cosmic impact, what did it hit? Where are the craters? The impact hypothesis researchers have an answer for this. The impacts, they suggest, occurred primarily over the North American ice sheet. A comet fragment or multiple fragments striking not solid ground but ice sheets up to 2 miles thick. The explosions would have been devastating, vaporizing billions of tons of ice instantly, triggering massive floods as meltwater surged across the landscape. But the craters themselves would have been temporary, filled in and erased as the glaciers continued to move and eventually melted completely. This would explain several mysteries. The sudden flooding evident in the geological record. The mass extinction of North American megafauna, giant mammals like mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats that had survived previous climate changes but suddenly vanished around 12,800 years ago. The widespread evidence of massive wildfires, with charcoal layers found across the continent suggesting that vast areas burned simultaneously. Most intriguingly, it would explain something that has puzzled anthropologists for over a century: the worldwide distribution of flood myths. Nearly every human culture on Earth has flood stories. The indigenous peoples of the Americas have countless versions. The Choctaw, the Hopi, the Algonquin, they all tell remarkably similar stories of a great flood destroying the world. Traditional archaeology has usually written this off as coincidence. Floods happen. Rivers overflow. But what if they're not independent? What if they're all dim memories of the same event, passed down through hundreds of generations. Here's what makes this idea so compelling and so disturbing. The details of these flood myths often match in ways that seem too specific to be coincidental. Many describe the flood as sudden and unexpected. They frequently mention fire falling from the sky before or during the flood. They often speak of the sun being darkened, of years of cold and darkness following the catastrophe. If you were an ancient human trying to describe a cosmic impact and its aftermath in mythological terms, this is pretty much exactly how you do it. Fire falling from the sky, the impacts, massive floods, the melting ice and resulting deluges, darkness and cold, the climate disruption and atmospheric debris blocking sunlight, the death of animals and destruction of civilization. Grant Hayes takes this a step further. He proposes that before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, there was an advanced civilization, not necessarily with our level of technology, but sophisticated enough to have developed agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and mathematics. This civilization, he suggests, was wiped out by the impacts, with only scattered survivors carrying fragments of their knowledge into the Stone Age. This is where mainstream archaeology draws a hard line. There's no evidence, they say, of any such civilization. No cities, no writing, no infrastructure. The archaeological record shows only hunter-gatherer societies at that period. If an advanced civilization had existed, we would have found it by now. But would we? Here's the uncomfortable question that won't go away. If a civilization existed 12,800 years ago, primarily in coastal areas that are now underwater, how much evidence would survive? The last ice age ended around 11,000 years ago. As the glaciers melted, sea levels rose by roughly 400 feet. Vast areas of coastline that were habitable during the Ice Age are now hundreds of feet beneath the ocean surface. If there were sophisticated settlements in these now submerged areas, they would be extraordinarily difficult to find. Consider this scenario. Small groups of humans, survivors of whatever catastrophe occurred, scattered across a world that had just become dramatically more hostile. Some of them carrying knowledge from before, practical skills and intellectual traditions that had been developed over thousands of years. Knowledge that would seem miraculous to hunter-gatherer populations struggling to survive. These survivors couldn't rebuild what was lost. Their numbers were too small, their resources too limited. But they could preserve fragments. They could teach their children stories about the old world, pass down whatever practical knowledge might be useful. Over generations, much of this would be lost or transformed into myth. But some might survive, encoded in stories, monuments, and traditions that would puzzle archaeologists thousands of years later. This is the heart of the ancient apocalypse theory. Not that aliens built the pyramids or that Atlantis had flying cars, but that human history has been punctuated by catastrophes severe enough to nearly reset civilization, and that we might be missing important chapters of our story because we're not looking in the right places or asking the right questions. The truth is, we don't know. What we do know is that 12,800 years ago, something happened. Something significant enough to leave traces in geology, in genetics, in the collective memory of human cultures worldwide. And in the aftermath of that something, human history took a sharp turn, setting us on the path that would lead to agriculture, civilization, and everything that came after. The survivors of whatever catastrophe occurred were tough, adaptable, and determined enough to rebuild. to take whatever knowledge they possessed and use it to create something new. They are our ancestors, as surely as the bottleneck survivors from 900,000 years ago. And their story, however incomplete our understanding of it remains, is part of what made us who we are today. But here's where things get really strange. Because scattered across the ancient world, we find artifacts and texts that seem to contain knowledge that shouldn't exist. Not mystical mumbo-jumbo or vague prophecies. Precise technical information, astronomical calculations, and geographic details that don't match what we think ancient humans should have known. Take the Potomac device. In 1901, divers exploring a colonial-era shipwreck off the coast of Virginia found something that would baffle scientists for over a century. A corroded lump of metal that, when X-rayed decades later, revealed something impossible. Gears. Dozens of precisely cut gears, fitted together in a complex mechanism that could calculate the positions of the sun, moon, and planets. It could predict eclipses. This thing appears to be ancient, far older than the ship it was found on. The next device we know of with this level of mechanical complexity doesn't appear until the Industrial Revolution. That's a massive gap. Imagine finding a laptop in a colonial chest. That's essentially what the Potomac device represents. The makers of this device built an astronomical computer using technology that wouldn't be reinvented for more than a millennium. But here's what keeps scientists up at night. This mechanism shows evidence of mature technology. The gears are precisely cut. The design is sophisticated, refined. This wasn't a first attempt. This was the product of a long tradition of mechanical engineering, which means there should be predecessors, simpler versions leading up to this masterpiece. We haven't found them. Then there's the Hudson map. In 1850, a historian found an old map in the archives of a New England library. The map, compiled by an explorer named Hudson, used source materials from indigenous tribes and earlier explorers. But when researchers examined the Hudson map, they noticed something extraordinary. The northern portion of the map shows the coast of Greenland without ice. A coastline, mountains, river valleys, details that match the actual topography of Greenland beneath the ice sheet. Topography we only discovered ourselves using ground-penetrating radar in the 20th century. So how did a colonial map, supposedly based on ancient indigenous sources, show accurate details of geography that was hidden under miles of ice? The standard explanation is that the mapmaker was just guessing. Maybe. But the level of detail is unsettling. Bays and inlets that actually exist. It's either an incredible coincidence or Hudson was copying sources that came from a time when Greenland's coast was visible, which would mean someone was exploring and mapping Greenland thousands of years ago. Now, let's talk about the Mississippi Record. This ancient set of tablets, found in the mounds of the Midwest, lists rulers going back to the beginning. Like many ancient king lists, it's partly historical and partly mythological. The later chiefs have reasonable reign lengths. But the earlier you go, the weirder it gets. The list mentions rulers who reigned for thousands of years. And before the Great Flood, there were rulers who collectively ruled for hundreds of thousands of years. These numbers are absurd, obviously. So scholars assume these are mythological figures. But here's the thing. The Mississippian culture were meticulous record keepers. They documented everything. So why suddenly insert fantasy numbers into an official record? One theory is that these aren't individuals. They're dynasties. Long periods of rule compressed into single names. But even adjusted, we're talking about an incredibly long prehistoric period. And the list makes a clear distinction. Before the flood, one set of rulers. After the flood, a completely different line. The flood divides history. Something happened. Something catastrophic enough to end one era of human civilization and begin another. Sound familiar? But the real bombshell came from genetics. In 2010, scientists sequenced DNA from a finger bone found in Denali Cave in Alaska. They were expecting ancient Native American DNA. Instead, they found something else. A third species of human, genetically distinct. They called them Denalians, and for a while, that single finger bone was the only physical evidence we had that they existed. But their DNA told a different story. Denalians interbred with modern humans. Extensively. Modern indigenous populations carry traces of this DNA. That finger bone represents a species that lived alongside us, shared territories with us, had children with us. An entire branch of humanity that we only discovered recently. And here's what makes this terrifying. If we only just discovered Denalians, who else haven't we found? How many other human species existed during that gap period between behavioral modernity and the rise of civilization? The genetic evidence suggests there were at least 3 major interbreeding events between different human populations. Maybe more. Small groups of advanced hominids, each with their own cultural traditions, technologies, and knowledge, meeting, mixing, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. What did they know? What could they do? And then most of them disappeared. Not all at once. Not from a single catastrophe. But gradually, over thousands of years, the genetic signal fades, absorbed into the modern human population or dying out in isolated pockets. All that's left are those fragments of DNA, floating through modern genomes like messages from ghosts. Which brings us back to those ancient texts and oral traditions. Because once you accept that there were multiple human species, some of them quite advanced, living during the gap period, suddenly those impossible knowledge claims start looking different. That astronomical precision? Maybe they didn't figure it out from scratch. Maybe they inherited fragments of knowledge from earlier cultures. Earlier species, even. Ancient observers could predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy. They knew the length of the solar year to within minutes. They tracked the movements of planets. How? They claimed their knowledge came from before the flood. From the star people, mythical sages who taught humanity. The builders of the mounds in Cahokia aligned their structures to true north with incredible accuracy. They did this supposedly using only simple tools. The mound's proportions encode mathematical constants. Their positions align with specific stars. The sophistication required is staggering, and the builders themselves claimed they didn't invent this knowledge. They said it came from the time of the first people. Mainstream scholars say these are poetic descriptions, metaphors, not literal events. But what if some of them are descriptions of real technologies, real events, filtered through millennia of oral tradition? What if ancient humans encountered things, other species, other civilizations, that they didn't fully understand. They would describe what they saw using the vocabulary they had. Advanced technology becomes magic. Other human species become spirits or giants. Catastrophic events become divine punishment. The pattern repeats across cultures. Flood myths. Stories of an earlier age when humans lived longer, were taller, were more advanced. Then catastrophe. Flood. Fire. Darkness. The old world ends. The new world begins. We've always assumed these are just myths. But what if they're fragments of actual history, distorted by time, mixed with mythology, but containing kernels of truth about real events during that gap period? Consider this. We know from the genetic bottleneck research that human populations crashed dramatically. We know multiple human species coexisted and interbred. We know behavioral modernity appeared suddenly, then seemingly vanished. We know sea levels have risen dramatically since the last ice age, drowning coastlines where most ancient humans would have lived. How much knowledge was lost? How many times did human cultures rise to significant levels of sophistication, only to be destroyed by climate change, disease, or collapse? And how much of that lost knowledge survived in fragments, copied from text to text, passed down through oral traditions, preserved in myths and legends that we dismiss as primitive superstition? The Potomac device proves ancient humans could build sophisticated technology. The genetic evidence proves multiple human species coexisted and exchanged knowledge. The archaeological evidence proves humans were behaviorally modern far earlier than we thought. And the texts, those strange, impossible texts, they keep insisting something came before. Something we've forgotten. Maybe they're right.